Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor. Everything is an honor, special honor. It's for me to be here, of course. And I really mean it. It's wonderful to have a second book in Hebrew. I don't speak Hebrew, but I read the introduction, and I think it's a very good one. Since I've been characterized by some of the speakers as a German thinker, I start with a small anecdote. The first time when I was talking about risk society in the British context, must be quite a long time ago, a very sophisticated sociologist, he was on technology and science studies, said, well, it's a very interesting book, but there's a German taste of security and wealth in the concept of risk society, and the British cannot afford being a risk society. I was quite embarrassed, and often I don't know how to answer those questions. You know, it will happen tonight as well. But 3 weeks later, the mad cow disease broke out. And suddenly Risk Society got quite an important book in the British public. So there might be a German background. But still, there's something more to it, and it might be even some of the discussion here today. Once upon a time, class and class conflict have been the main notions for sociologists to understand the dynamics of the modern world. But this is no longer the case. Think of the main cosmopolitical occasions for the last 20, 25 years. The breakdown of the Berlin Wall and the East-West conflict, 9/11, financial crisis, and the ongoing Arab revolution, revolt. We don't know how to call it anyway, but it's happening. And many other occasions like this. What do those occasions have in common? First of all, they come by total surprise. This means sociologists, and not only sociologists, are not prepared. They don't have any framework to analyze those really big movements and events. Second, they all are transnational. They are not national anymore, sometimes even global, as we know. And this has a lot of implication and a lot of background. So there is actually no conventional social scientific frame of reference to understand what are the big events and the big changes which are happening in the world today. My thesis is class is too soft a category. It's too soft. It's not able to get the dramatic political dimension of social inequality anymore. If you look at the history back, we have maybe a different version and vision of class, but nowadays we are confronted with a different kind of inequality which cannot be captured mainly by class. Why is this so? Because social sciences and politics frame inequalities in a nation-state perspective. The social sciences are still prisoners of the nation-state. This is a background of the history of the social sciences, which came up under conditions of the invention of the nation-state. And if you look at the theories, big theories, they often don't really take the process of nationalization of state seriously. Somehow the nation state is suddenly there, because it is self-evident that this is the main structure and perspective for the social sciences. So, if we want to understand what's happening in the world now, we have to challenge one of the basic assumptions of social sciences, which I call methodological nationalism. We have to challenge methodological nationalism. I come to this right now. I will develop this argument in 4 steps. First, critique of methodological nationalism. Second, we are not living in an age of cosmopolitanism, but in an age of cosmopolitization. This is a difference which I really will stress quite strongly. And third, what are the consequences of human rights regimes for the legitimation or delegitimation of global inequalities? And fourth, how can human rights be positioned in the current cosmopolitan constellation? So first, critique of methodological nationalism. Methodological nationalism means that the social sciences, the observer of the social reality and actors, equalize national borders with society and state. This seems very normal to us. But actually it is a historical product coming up from the 19th century, and there's no logical connection between society and nationality as an evident natural connection. The perception of social inequality in everyday life, politics, and scholarship is based on a worldview that equates territorial, political, economic, social, and cultural borders. In fact, however, the world is becoming ever more networked and interconnected. Territorial, state, economic, social, and cultural borders still do exist, but they no longer coincide. In the sociology of inequality, everything has been questioned. Classes, strata, lifestyles, milieus, individualization, but not actually the territorial reference point of class. Not the nation-state frame of social inequality. Most theorists of class, including, for example, Bourdieu, who thought so extensively about globalization in his final years, identified class society with a nation state. The same is true of Wallerstein. In a different way, he is enlarging the nation state to the world system, thinking about the nation as the largest vision, and Goldthorpe in another way, he still defends class sociology in Britain. And I have to say myself, my individualization theory or my individualization thesis has been captured by methodological nationalism in the first place too. So actually this is a very common way of arguing in sociology, and it's only lately that this becomes a problem. Let me show it in more detail in relation to social inequality. National income has been the main unit of research of social inequalities during the 19th and first half of the 20th century. That is how total income was split between large social classes, workers of different kinds, and capitalists maybe of different types. This was the framing to be kept self-evident as the key topic in political economy. Methodological nationalism determines all thinking and all research concerned with inequality in 3 ways. The first type of methodological nationalism asked what determines inequality among individuals within a single nation. Social inequality is a dependent variable that is something that ought to be explained by the conditions inside of the nation state. This again is a actually a theoretical problem. The second type of methodological nationalism is actually methodological internationalism. The comparative studies presuppose nation states and national data as well, and make a comparison between those different units. This is, of course, an improvement, and it's a very important step because we look as sociologists beyond our own nation state and compare those different structures and data. But still, you use a nation state as a basic unit for research. And the third type is the third type of methodological nationalism makes global inequality, or inequality among all citizens of the world, to be the unit of research and politics. Again, a very important improvement, which came actually up, or did have a new impetus under the Bedingung of globalization. But actually, those global data and those global structures of inequalities are products of national data, using national data, reorganizing those national data, and are somehow abstract in relation to the living conditions of people. The global inequality is a construction of something which is statistically in this or that dimension and has a problem with relating to different milieus and different life worlds and so on and so forth. So you could say a lot to those different versions of methodological nationalism, but why do I criticize those versions? Maybe this is a quite good way of catching different aspects of inequality. All three versions follow the logic of the national. All three are actually explaining and expelling the version of the national. First on the national, then on the international, and then on the global level. It's actually the way of enlarging and widening the national perspective. So what is the alternative? The political dynamic, the political explosive dynamic of social inequalities undermines exactly these distinctions between national, international, and global. So this is my second point. We do not live in an age of cosmopolitanism, but in an age of cosmopolitization. This calls for an idea of cosmopolitization as encounter or enmeshment with the global other. Cosmopolitization as encounter or enmeshment with the global other, rather than just simply being dependent with something or someone who is outside. Cosmopolitization, therefore, is not cosmopolitanism. It's not an ideology. It's not a philosophical system of ideas. It is not globalization, because globalization is something which is happening outside. It's maybe mostly related to economic globalization. It is not only diversity, or it's not only transnationalism, because neither diversity itself nor transnationalism or globality guarantees this existential encounter with the other. This notion of cosmopolitization is often misunderstood. I have to confess, well, this could be part of our discussion, that choosing the word cosmopolitanism and choosing the word cosmopolitization is a very interesting and maybe controversial decision to look and focus at the specific social reality which I have in mind. So you shouldn't just stick to this term. You should open up to the reality which I have in mind. So therefore, cosmopolitanism is about norms, is about philosophy. Cosmopolitization is about facts, something which is happening in the real world. And cosmopolitization is not, as many misunderstand it, is not something which is consciously, which is an orientation. Those are not people who are becoming cosmopolitans. Cosmopolitization is a structural phenomenon. Well, those are lots of big and ambitious sociological concepts and words. So let me try to illustrate this by giving some examples, getting down to earth to examples. I have, I think, 3 only because of the time limit. First, fresh kidneys. Second, global care chains. And third, competition between workers. First, fresh kidneys. The victory of medical transplantation, and not its crisis, the victory of modernization and not its crisis, has swept away its own ethical foundation and opened the floodgates to an occult shadow economy supplying the world market with fresh organs. In the radically unequal world, there's obviously no shortage in desperate individuals willing to sell a kidney, a portion of their liver, a lung, an eye, or even a testicule for pittance. The fates of desperate patients waiting for organs have become obscurely embroiled with the fates of no less desperate poor people, as each group struggling to find a solution to basic problems of survival. This is what the age of Ant creates: cosmopolitanism of deprivation, or cosmopolitization of deprivation. In a fascinating case study, the anthropologist Nancy Shepherd-Hughes has shown how the excluded of the world, the economically and politically dispossessed, refugees, the homeless, street children, undocumented workers, prisoners, aging prostitutes, and so on, are lured into selling their organs, and this way becoming physically, morally, and economically embodied in the mortally sick bodies and in the persons who are rich enough to buy and incorporate the organs of the excluded others. In the individualized bodyscape of the cosmopolitization, age of cosmopolitization, continents, races, classes, nations, and religions all become fused. Muslim, well, I read these all sentences because, I really worked on them. I think they have to be noticed. So it's a literary work, so I'm going to read them to you. It's very difficult to be ironic as a German professor, It's very difficult. It's very difficult. You have to have a hard work in trying to get this across. So it's signal, it's just a little bit. So Muslim kidneys purify Christian blood. White racist breathes with the aid of one or more black lungs. The blunt manager gazes out at the world through the eyes of an African street urchin. A secular millionaire survives thanks to the liver carved from a prostitute living in Brazilian favelas. So, what does this example tell us? First of all, cosmopolitization is related to global capitalism. It's not something which is happening by chance. It's global capitalism, world market, which produces consequences in many directions and in this area as well. Second, it's related to the international division of labor and related to the global power relations and the relations of inequality. This is materialized in the bodies. And it is a structural phenomenon. It is not necessarily in the self-definition of the people who are involved. The biopolitical citizen of the world, as a biopolitical citizen of the world, emerges a white male body, fit or fat, with an addition of an Indian kidney or a Muslim eye, etc., etc. So, cosmopolitization is this enmeshment with the excluded other. It's still excluded. It's part of our body on the one hand, and still excluded. So this is a difficult thing to understand. It's not either or, it's both and. And exactly this process, I think, symbolizes our age of cosmopolitization. Second example, global care chains. If we look at the sexual division of labor in households, two trends stand out. First, men of the younger generations, when compared to their fathers or grandfathers, take much more active part in the upbringing of their offsprings, from taking them to kindergarten to supervising sport or playground activities and so on. Even if we have to confess, our rhetoric is much farther than our real acting. Second, with the exception of the Scandinavian countries, the changes are modest in scope. In most countries of the West, women still bear the greatest burdens of responsibilities in regard to child rearing. And when it comes to household activities, men participation is even lower. The result is the cosmopolitization of many middle-class households, the outsourcing or insourcing of family work to women from countries of the so-called second or third world, or to put it differently, the rise of a transnational shadow economy. When we speak of migrant domestic workers, we speak of women from all parts of the globe, women from Mexico who work in California as nannies, women from the Philippines who care for the elderly in Israel or Italy, women from Poland who clean houses and do the laundry for German families. Obviously, the migrant workers have to bear most of the risks of their occupation, of their specific position in the society. They don't only have one position in one society. They have two positions in different societies, and their specific position cannot be understood only from one frame of reference. You have to, it has been disconnected by the nation state, and seemingly objective reality, in their point of view, in their horizons, has to be connected. And sociology, in order to understand this, has to study those two interrelated horizons as well. So migrant workers have to bear most of the risks. They are trapped in a semi-legal shadow economy. They often have no visa, no work permit, no residence right. Often also they have no access to public health service. They are vulnerable to exploitations. There's a whole literature on this on the international level. It's not just a small thing. It's really one of the big labor market issues on the global scale. And all this can be documented quite well. The three words characterize those working in the shadow economy: hardworking, cheap, and illegal. Many of the women working abroad have left their family back in their home countries. The old times, it was a proof of your love that you stick together, no matter what. Yet now, in long-distance families, the opposite holds true. For migrants, domestic workers all over the globe, love means, first of all, having to go away. New patterns of transnational motherhood are being created, those different ways of motherhood in different spheres. And mothering, as Hochschild says, mothering is passed down the race, class, nation hierarchy. The age of cosmopolitization creates a new global hierarchy of delegation. The work implied by the 3 C's, caring, cleaning, cooking, is outsourced along the lines of nations, colors, and ethnicity. When we look at the family from a national point of view, we don't see this. Actually, it happens just as an individual case. Somebody has a nanny or something. It doesn't matter really. Only if we look from a cosmopolitan point of view, we suddenly find out that there are new kinds of life coming up. First of all, in the national context, there's a hidden cosmopolitization. The inequality of the world is part of your own household now, in the person you hire, in his or her status, in illegal or legal status. So actually, seemingly, family still has a wall behind it, maybe even closing it more and more, but at the same time, the global other is right in the middle of our lives, even if we don't recognize it. And, well, of course, at the same time, there are new kinds of motherhood, transnational motherhood coming up, which have to be studied by its own, which have specific relations between those women. So again, we have this cosmopolitization, and this cosmopolitization is not something which comes from the outside. It's not global or something, or it's not just on the outside. Just in the middle of our life it's happening. And it's not happening because globalization forces us to change our life, but because the internal structures of a relationship between men and women, emancipation of women, participation in the labor market of women, and men not really taking part in the household, there comes up this need for including the other in our own context. And of course, for example, the children, I don't know, this might be the case in Israel as well, the children from those mothers only speak Hebrew because they only lived here, but still they are not getting citizenship rights because they don't belong. They are in and out at the same time. Again, we have this cosmopolitization. Even if it's not reflected as cosmopolitanism or something, it's a reality which is coming. My last example, competition between national populations of workers. The increasing power of capital is prompting a sweeping transformation of the labor market, and this is occurring without public ballots or democratic decision-making processes, without consultation and without those affected having any say in this process. The labor market is being rocked by tectonic shifts from north to south, from west to east, which threaten the existence of millions of workers and their families, mostly in the rich countries. Employees in the affluent countries are becoming replaceable on the global scale. They can be let off and replaced by employees which are much cheaper in the poor, low-wage countries. In first modernity, national borders were also borders for competition. You didn't have any competition between nation states and national societies. Under conditions of globalization, suddenly we have worldwide competition. Whole populations of workers are being in some kind of relation with each other. They are being cosmopolitanized by being replaceable. So here the existential enmeshment means that the unknown other in another country or even in a different global region is becoming the eternal economic enemy for the inhabitants of the affluent countries, because he or she is threatening their jobs, their wages, and their prosperity. The result is a hostility toward foreigners in spreading, reaching to some extent even epidemic proportions. So first of all, we can see that this kind of cosmopolitization is a structural phenomenon. Again, those workers who are replaceable don't have any contact. There's no dialogue. There's nothing, well, there's some kind of consciousness about this, but it's nothing which is really part of this cosmopolitization is not being part of a cosmopolitan consciousness or something like that. It's just the opposite. Anti-cosmopolitan sentiments and movements come from this, and very strong ones. For cosmopolitization does not create cosmopolitans. Cosmopolitization is a shock for most of the people and produces just the opposite. Anti-cosmopolitan, in many cases, anti-cosmopolitan sentiments. There is no dialogue or communicative interaction between those who are dependent on each other. And this is not something which is on a small scale, but which is actually on a large scale. And again, those who think in class categories don't get this transnational cosmopolitical situation where whole national populations of workers suddenly get in opposition to each other. Not the class category anymore. Something quite differently is happening, and we are not open so far. We don't have even the frame of reference to understand those dynamics. So what are the implications of these very different case studies on cosmopolitization? The word cosmopolitan becomes indispensable for describing a situation in which humanity and world are not only thinkable but unavoidable moral categories for humans the world over. It is clear that this comes with the unsettling recognition that the very processes that have brought the cosmopolitan possibility of human cooperation and transnational coordination so close to hand have simultaneously aggravated existing differences and in many cases inspired anti-cosmopolitan cleavages to emerge. Sociologically speaking, then, cosmopolitization has gained plausible and immediance more as a widespread elucidation of humanity's collective dilemmas at the beginning of the third millennium than as any specific ethical or political program for their solution. Actually, we don't have any solution for these new kind of cosmopolitization processes and its ambivalences. Rather, we are witness to the opening of a new chapter full of strife and controversy over the very meaning not only of the word good society, but of the word a good world, and significantly who gets to define it. My third point, human rights or the delegitimation of cosmopolitan inequalities. Let me come back to the question again. What are the basic problems of methodological nationalism? Methodological nationalism, in its different forms, fails to capture the problems of delegitimation of inequalities and the political explosiveness. This fundamental weakness can clearly be seen in John Rawls' theory of justice, but also in his later work, The Law of Peoples. Rawls, as a philosopher, is very explicit about being a methodological nationalist. If you ever want to find out what methodological nationalism means, you should read him, because he is very explicit in the assumptions, really taking those assumptions seriously. Social sciences normally don't do it. This is the difference between a philosopher reflecting its own background assumptions. He always wanted to ask what is fairness within a nation, and this was actually his topic of his first book, and the latter one, Rawls went further and addressed the issue of global governance and global justice, but even then he only adapts an international perspective by arguing it is duty of liberal, well-ordered people to help burdened societies. Once burdened societies are transformed into well-ordered societies, differences in income levels, between the nations are no longer of any relevance. If it is once ordered in this liberal way, the differences don't have any meaning anymore. He argues, I quote, "Once all people have a working, liberal, or decent government, there is no reason to narrow the gap between average wealth and different peoples. Those differences in roles, perspective, are the outcome of differences justified by the collective performance of principle and national preferences. This nationally bounded and biased perspective on justice misses exactly, from a sociological point of view, the important question, which is, I think, so important from a sociological point of view. Why and under what conditions do social inequalities lose their legitimation?" And we actually have him, well, this question is quite common in the national context. Of course, we are used to all kinds of inequalities, and they are legitimate if they are related to performance. The performance principle justifies differences of inequality. This is our background. And then, of course, all kinds of conflicts come up if this is the case or not. But this doesn't have an answer to why don't we accept or don't we relate to global inequalities? Why do global inequalities don't have any effect on the national political agenda? It's only a moral issue, but it's not very effective on the political agenda. The answer is because of national borders. National borders make the other irrelevant. The other is not part of our own perception, because only those inequalities become political which are inside of a horizon of institutionalized equality, norms of equality. This might, of the first view, be paradox, but only if we have the assumption of a horizon of equal norms, only then inequality becomes important. If we don't have this horizon of equal norms, then it doesn't matter. Beyond borders, all kinds of inequalities can happen without being recognized and relevant to the national political or any political agenda. So on the national level, the performance principle legitimates inequalities. On the global level, national borders legitimate global inequalities. And the interesting difference is now, and here comes where the human rights regime comes in. Only under conditions of equality norms, like the human rights regimes, transnational inequalities become important. The more equality, or the broader the horizon of equality, the more inequalities become politicized. And this is, of course, it has a different perspective from the outside and from the inside. In the inside, you don't recognize it. From the outside, you do recognize it much more, because you want to be part of the universality of human rights. And therefore, you see yourself as a human being who is part whose position is not legitimate in relation to its own perception. But on the national perspective, you are being excluded because you are not part of this new constellation. So the first condition of delegitimation of social inequalities is the institutionalization of human rights regime. The more human rights regimes are being institutionalized, the more there is a politicization of social inequality on a global scale. So human rights are delegitimating social inequalities on the national level. And again, this is a sociologically important insight, because not only the increase of global inequalities, but the institutionalized of equality norms makes a big difference for politicizing social inequalities. Even if there would be a lessening of the differences of status, even if there would be attempts to really effectively fight global poorness and things like that, this wouldn't make the difference, because in the horizon of equal norms, suddenly you are beginning to compare those different positions, and suddenly the inequalities are being politicized. The ongoing transformation of the Arab world is actually a demonstration of this case. I think how the belief in equality of human rights make inequalities comparable and thereby politically explosive. And this is exactly the transnational dynamic, which is so obviously and surprising at the same time. An Arab networked and no-job generation is overturning the Middle East order of Arab totalitarian regimes, and the uprising erupts across a region, the long resistance to change. Islamists were part of these revolts, but not actually those who started it. They have been driven by a secular youth hoping for freedom, and this young global generation is institutionalized and cosmopolitanized at the same time by internet, Facebook, etc. And this generation is encouraged by taking human rights seriously. And again, mainstream sociology, which actually is most of the time focusing on the reproduction of order and not the transformation of order, fails to capture this historical moment. My fourth and last point, positioning human rights in the current cosmopolitan conjuncture. The practical discourse of human rights claims the burden of safeguarding the most fundamental features in conditioning of our humanity. Insofar as this universalistic vocation can conflict with the state's governance of its citizens, human rights discourse is the other way of giving a human face to cosmopolitanization, as Nathan Schneider and Daniel Levy argue in their work. Thus, in this perspective, there is a moral and political contradiction between the processes of cosmopolitization and human rights. It is not difficult to illustrate this in relation to all the examples I gave you. Cosmopolitization means the global other is no longer out there, but is part of our own life, and this has all kinds of different implications for not only a cosmopolitan identity, but just the opposite. Thus, on the one hand, the dynamics of global capitalism enforces an enmeshment with the global other, which could open up spaces and perspective for the implementation of human rights regimes. Not only transnational media and telecommunication networks, but also global risks like climate change, financial crisis, and some extent even the terrorist threat, create global publics and promise to unite us into a common humanity. Rather than see cosmopolitization as particular or singular condition that either exists or does not exist, we should instead see it as an ethical, political medium of societal transformation that is based on the principles of world openness. And this principle of world openness is associated with the notion of global publics. Viewed in these terms, reflexive cosmopolitization is an involuntary form of world disclosure. and arises out of the imminent possibilities of the social world for transformations. On the other hand, at the same time, these processes also raise the deepest concerns about the continuing preservation of our humanity. These understanding of cosmopolitization as a set of processes that can have inhuman consequences if they are not regulated by human influences are, of course, not new. It repeats a time analytically schema whereby the anthropophy characterizing human interaction and social endeavor requires a higher normative force to hold it in check. For instance, moral sentiments by Adam Smith, socialized labor by Marx, or critical reason by the Frankfurt School from Adorno to Habermas. The intensified debates about human rights in recent years are driven exactly by this logic. This finally raises the question, how can the human condition of cosmopolitization be successfully dealt with under the conditions of multiple competing modernities with their different normative models, cultural perceptions, material interests, and political power constellations? My key to this question, to answering this question, is provided by what I call cosmopolitical realpolitik. In order to understand and develop this concept, it has to be distinguished in particular from normative philosophical cosmopolitanism on the one hand, and idealistic utopian cosmopolitanism on the other. Cosmopolitical realpolitik does not appeal to shared ideas and identities, but to power and national interests. If we adopt such a realist perspective, the crucial question is how the meta-power games of global politics can be shaped and interest pursued in such a way that they serve the realization of a cosmopolitan goal. The concept of cosmopolitical realpolitik, which aims at answering this question, is based on the following assumptions. The age of cosmopolitization means that no nation can master its problems alone. And those who play the national card will lose. On the long run, maybe on the short run as well. Arguably, for the first time in history, cosmopolitan commitments exert real-world significance. There are two scenarios, many scenarios actually, but let me just put it in the contrast of two scenarios. One scenario, and I'm often being accused that I'm only in favor of the first scenario, that I'm actually in the background have a Hegelian position, a Hegelian scenario which promises the emergence of a collaborative cosmopolitan imperative. A cosmopolitan imperative, cooperate or fail. Or, I don't know if I could say this, human rights or human catastrophe. However, at the same time, there raises a sinister alternative to the Carl Schmitt scenario, normalize the state of exception and enforce an authoritarian regime. Of course, one of the many interesting questions is what happens in Israel? A Hegelian scenario or a Carl Schmitt scenario or both scenarios, and in which mixture? Thank you very much.
This is an opportunity to thank Professor Ulrich Beck. Also to open for discussion. We have some time to hear questions from the audience, and Professor Beck will respond. And after that, we will have the promised symposium. So, questions from the audience? Please, Professor Jorobinski. But just wait a second so that people who need to leave. And Lior, if you could please speak up.
Thank you for a fascinating speech. I wanted to ask you about your example of the Arab Revolution, because I wanted to get clear about the cosmopolitanism. Because as I see it, it is if there was a cosmopolitan component to it, inequality, they would revolt against the West. But they revolted against their own regimes, asking for more equality with the elite there. And now, so I would think that Al-Qaeda is more of your global inequality perspective, while this, so I would like you to
Yes.
talk more about how do you move from the national to the...
Yes.
Professor Beck, before you answer, I was asked to repeat the question. First, maybe people didn't hear, and then, so I won't repeat the full question, but we're also recording. So the question concerned, in general terms, your statement about the relation between the Arab Revolution that we see now in many countries and your notions of cosmopolitanism.
Yeah. Let me start with a small remark. We have a hard time in using the right term. Is this actually only an Arab word, or is Israel included to some extent? Even we are always talking about an Arab revolution, not taking Israel into this view. Even the terms you're using or I'm using are somehow confusing and not really put it on the table. Well, I think what I mean by the amazing thing is with the Arab revolt or whatever we could call it, it's transnational. It's a transnational movement. It's not related to only one country, but it's spreading like a disease or health, like a health thing, which suddenly people want freedom in different countries. So actually, I think it is this transnational. You couldn't understand it from a national point of view because of this transnationality, and this means that there's a cosmopolitization, not a cosmopolitanism maybe, but a cosmopolitization going on because of the new networks of communication, of Facebook, and so on and so on. I think it's an impression of an emerging globalized generation in different cultural contexts, which are not so different as we thought them to be in national contexts. And of course, the revolution is against the national power structure. What should a revolution be if not against the national power structure? But it's not. You couldn't understand it only from the different national point of views, even if there are different cultural and political backgrounds for it.
Two short questions. The first concerns your third proposition, and the second concerns your fourth. As regards to your third proposition, I'm curious. You mentioned the equalizing effect of the human rights regime as something that opens and politicizes the idea of distributive justice or the lack thereof at the global level. Do you really think that suffices with no regime of global governance, as against views that think that political participation or co-authorship of a political community like NATO's is the premise of global claims for equality in the distributive sense. The second question concerns what you put as a cooperate or fail, and it's to some extent it's a follow-up to the first one, and it relates back to your third example regarding the labor market. which I think suggests that at point it may be compete or fail.
Yes.
Especially if we are interested in distributive justice, at times cooperation would just be a means for creating a cartel among the strong, which blocks the way of the weakest of the weak nations to enter into global markets. So maybe the idea is cooperate by way of allowing competition.
Yes. Well, it's very interesting. Both very interesting questions. Thank you very much. Well,
so I don't think I will be able to repeat it, but the first one was about. The first one is about the possibility of human rights in a cosmopolitan age, whether that required global governance, structures of governance, and the second raised the question about whether cosmopolitanism could also lead to cooperation against the weak.
Yes. Well, the first question, I think, of course, actually you could see, you could argue on a global institutional level and on a perspective from below, from what people adopt as their vision. And actually we do have, of course, some form of global governance, but they are not very strong so far, as we know. Well, we do have in Europe. Europe is actually, if you ask what is essential about Europe, it's law. It's law. It's a European law. There's no European government, but it's law. So we do have a court system and anything. But the interesting thing is that migrants and legal and illegal migrants in all different forms are actually anticipating equal rights because of many reasons, because, I don't know, from advertisement to what people say, politicians say, and this is actually one of their motive, and their perception of having a legal and a legitimate interest in going to the West. And we say, well, you don't have anything like that because you just want to have a good business and so on and so on. And so we keep them out. I think this cosmopolitization from below is a very important issue because people don't define themselves, or many of those migrants don't define themselves in the national context. They want to get ahead in their status by just crossing borders. This is what we call actually mobility, and we always say you have to be flexible, you have to mobile, but please don't come from a different country. Then it's troubling us. So actually, this is the contradiction, and therefore I think we have to look from below, from those motives coming from below, and well, cooperate or fail, or competition or fail. My point of view was mainly on the workers and not on the corporations. You are correct in relation to the corporations, I would say, because competition is the element to overcome hierarchies and monopoly to some extent, as we know, to some extent. But in relation to the workers, it's different. And I think we didn't think really so far about what the cosmopolitization of workers mean, because we still think very much in national categories, and we don't see how those opening of borders in many ways, especially for global capital and investment, changes the situation of workers in whole national communities. And I wouldn't say, well, actually, this is the anti-cosmopolitan imperative. It is actually the closure of nation states. What we actually feel and recognize and realize in many movements, especially in Europe, but in many other cases as well. So I wanted to show how cosmopolitization in this specific case produces the opposite, produces anti-cosmopolitan sentiments.
So we probably have time for 3 more questions. Professor Ratzlick.
My question is about the parallel you draw between the role of national boundaries and the role of performance. I don't see them doing the same thing. national boundaries actually, with national boundaries, we don't see inequality. It's
That's right. That's completely right.
and that's
Yes.
why they're not a political problem.
That's right.
We don't see them.
That's
At the
right.
local level, we see them, but we justify them by faith.
That's right.
In the best case scenario, if national boundaries collapse, we are back to square one, where we have just one big nation state, and we see them. Now we come to justify them. We
Yes.
can play the card of performance again.
Yes.
Then the collapse of national boundaries, at the best case scenario, bring us back to the national case scenario, and then we can play the card of performance. That doesn't overcome the problem.
No, it doesn't. I'm sorry.
So the question concerned the relation and whether there was a parallel, could be drawn a parallel between national boundaries
Yes.
and performance, as you said.
Yes, it's a very interesting question. I actually mostly agree what you said. It's very important to see that the performance principle is to some extent visible and has its own measures and has its indicators, but borders don't really legitimate inequalities. They just make us not see and take them not relevant. Those, and not only on a personal level, but on a political and national level. And of course, if you think that those national borders disappear or to some extent open up, then I would say the negative cosmopolitization process is really beginning. I think the good example of this is Europe. In a European context, we still are very much concentrating on the national inequalities, class structures, as sociologists. But now we are actually in relation to the euro crisis, we are in a transnational global inequality dynamic where southern and northern countries and so on have different positions of inequality. And this produces nationalism. Doesn't produce cosmopolitanism, it produces nationalism, renationalization. And this is exactly, I think, this is not a very optimistic point of view, because only the national attitudes seem to have seem to be the main reaction to this new cosmopolitanized dynamics of inequalities.
Specifically Islam. What's going on now in our neighbor countries is not just some democratic drive. There are powers behind it which have very much to do with Islamic, more than religion, I think. It's sort of an idealism, something like this, which is cosmopolitan within that wing, which is the youth wing, the youth part of the world population.
Yeah.
How do you see that? I don't
And I think the question is clear. So the question concerns the role of Islam and religion in general in the recent revolts or uprisings that we've seen in Arab countries. And yeah, of course.
Well, it's, of course, again, a very difficult question to answer in just making a few remarks. First of all, in relation to religion and cosmopolitization, Islam and different Protestant and Catholic and so on, all kind of religions, are not geographically isolated anymore. They are in all spaces. All the different religions are in all places and spaces. This makes the situation so dense and so violent to some extent, because the exclusive visions of a real truth, of a religious truth, suddenly collide in all spaces, I think, and this makes it. But you cannot exclude them anymore because they're in the public anyway. The religious other is in our midst. We don't get rid of them anymore, and this is think this is the new constellation. In relation to the, well, we don't know much about the Arab Revolution so far. We are not very much knowledge, and we don't even have the concept for it. But I think there are quite a lot of parallels in relation to the breakdown of the Berlin Wall and the breakdown of the Eastern Europe Empire. It came by surprise. It changed the whole political structure. Suddenly, communist countries became democratic and capitalistic with all kind of objections. And I have the feeling that this is true for Germany, and maybe it's even true for Israel as well, that since we are in Germany and in Europe very much frightened by an Islamic enemy image, which to some extent, of course, has its truth, but in many ways isn't true. We are not taking the right position to. We have a hard of time on understanding what's going on there, because at least in the first movements, as far as our data tell us, those young peoples are not fundamentalist Muslims. They are just normal, I would even say Western young people who want a nice job and be acknowledged and have some liberties and things like that. I'm not sure if this is going to be the end of this movement. Of course, there's lots of things are happening, but our image of an Islamic enemy makes us not realize the possibilities of what is happening in the breakdown of the Arab world. This was the difference between actually the breakdown of communism, because everybody welcomed it. It was the new perspective of westernization and democratic way of thinking and acting. But even if there is a great impetus in this direction, it's not being recognized this way.
So we have time right now only for one more question, so I apologize for those who won't have the opportunity to ask. But I want to say, again, we'll have the symposium, Professor Beck will respond, and then there will be more time for questions. So, Snate.
I want to bring in an aspect that hasn't been touched upon, and is usually not touched upon. This is the aspect of race and ethnicity.
Yes.
And to what extent these inequalities that are being discussed, in some mysterious way, really overlap, in many ways, the older divisions of race and ethnicity,
Yeah.
which are reconstituted in the post-genomic era even by biology.
Yes.
So the question concerned inequality from the perspective of race and ethnicity.
Yes. Well, if maybe I wasn't clear enough in my examples, but if you, for example, if you take the first one, you could even say that the differences between race, ethnicity, and inequality and imperialism, which we know from the history, is being reproduced in a new way of connecting even the bodies of the different people. So actually it is about reaffirming all those differences. It's part of the cosmopolitization process, but the difference is that we cannot isolate each other anymore. They are really interconnected. And this doesn't mean that there's a cosmopolitan sentiment coming up, but they're inside and outside at the same time. And this is a different situation. And this situation makes people really nervous, because so far we could say just exclude them. You know, in Germany you have to realize this, which is, I think, quite an interesting fact. Kids under 5 years, at least 1/4 of kids under 5 years have binational parents. So actually, cosmopolitization is happening very much, you know. And if, for example, I don't know if you know the discussion from Sarrazin, who has quite an impact in the German context. What would be the consequences? Do they want those children to get away, exclude them to some place? Or, well, this is what cosmopolitization means. They are here, they are part, even if you want to, well, maybe he is going to be grandfather to one half German, half Indian boy sometimes. So what is going to do? You know, this is what cosmopolitization means. You cannot exclude the other anymore. And this is actually what makes people so nervous and makes the difference of former imperialisms and hierarchies and so on.
Thank you very much. We will resume here in 10 minutes. There is some refreshments outside, but please be prompt in returning.